Donald, this is tonight's last word. There is breaking news on the special prosecutor's investigation involving House staffer who has spent the most time with President Trump. White House Communications Director Hope Hicks. She is a 29-year-old former model who worked for the Trump family in public relations before Donald Trump ran for president. Like most Trump campaign staffers, she would not have been hired by any other presidential campaign. Here's how Donald Trump introduced her last December to a rally audience in Alabama.
Now, Hope Hicks is a tremendously talented person. She started off with us right from day one. She used to be in my real estate company. I said, "What do you know about politics?" She said, "Absolutely nothing." I say, "Congratulations, you're into the world of politics," right? She knew nothing. And she was there the first day, and she was fantastic. And I just say a couple of words, Hope. You know, she's a little shy, but that's okay, because she is really, really talented. Hope, say a couple of words.
Hi. Merry Christmas, everyone. And thank you, Donald Trump.
Hope Hicks began work at the White House as a staff member on the communications team, whose most prominent member then was White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Hope Hicks has a unique position in the history now of the job of White House Communications Director. She is the fourth communications director to serve in the first year of the Trump White House. No other White House in history has burned through 3 communications directors in the first year and gone on to their fourth. And so Hope Hicks is the fourth communications director in the first year of a White House. And she would be the White House communications director with the least experience in politics and government in the history of that job, were it not for her immediate predecessor in the job, the unforgettable Anthony Scaramucci, who lasted a total of 11 days in that position. But there is a huge asterisk on those 11 days, because Anthony Scaramucci had not even taken his place on the White House payroll when he was fired from that job that he was in for only 11 days. Or was he only pretending to be in that job for 11 days? We will have to leave all of that to the presidential historians to sort out. So Hope Hicks is the second least experienced White House communications director in history, second only to Anthony Scaramucci, and she is the youngest. She's absolutely the youngest White House communications director in history. Now, we would show you more video of Hope Hicks speaking if we had any, but she avoids cameras and microphones even more than Jared Kushner. She is in her position because she exhibits, by all accounts, the thing Donald Trump prizes most: loyalty. Donald Trump obviously cares nothing about intelligence or wisdom or judgment or experience or knowledge of the workings of government. Loyalty is everything to Donald Trump, and Hope Hicks's loyalty is being
Russia. There's all Mueller's interest in the president's public shaming of his attorney general last summer, which also continued today, frankly. I want to start the hour with CNN's Jeff Zeleny at the White House. So, Jeff, what's the latest? What have you learned?
Anderson, of all the times we have stood here and talked about people leaving the White House, none is as consequential, perhaps, to the president as this. Hope Hicks, the communications director, said today she is resigning. A big question of why came out. I mean, it took everyone by surprise. Her aides, her followers. She has many admirers here inside the West Wing. She, I'm told, was meeting with some staff members. She was crying. They were crying. But she said it's a time that she believes she has to leave to pursue other opportunities. Now, of course, the timing is naturally suspect. One day after she appeared before the House Intelligence Committee for that closed-door hearing for some, for 8 hours or so, and a couple months, of course, after she appeared before Bob Mueller's committee answering questions. Hope Hicks is not a political expert or savant, but she is a reader of Donald Trump. She's an expert in Trump lingo, and she was one person who had Oval Office access really more than anyone else, besides potentially family members. So there is a sense here of what does this all mean? I mean, this is a sense of it has shaken people here, Anderson. And the question is, what will the president do from here? He's relied on her for so many things. Will this change how he adapts and reacts to things? But again, a couple people are pointing to she was here at very key moments. On Air Force One, of course, last summer when that statement was written about that Trump Tower meeting. She was on that flight from Germany back to Washington. She was with the president through many of these key periods. Of course, many of these now are of interest to investigators, but today she said she was leaving.
What's the White House reaction been to her departure?
I mean, the president, of course, praised her. He said that, he wished her well. So it's been very positive, but there's still a question of why now. I mean, there is a sense that this pressure cooker environment here is really taking its toll on a lot of people. She, of course, was with him longer than virtually anyone else, from those campaign rallies early on, long before anyone thought he could be president. And she was able to change his views on some things and soften his temper on some things. She would sometimes send out his tweets. So this is someone who we cannot express enough how close she was to him. But the reality is, at some point when she leaves in the coming weeks, he will go on without her. So will that change his demeanor? And what does it mean overall? She is still, of course, has been the subject of questions from Capitol Hill as well as the special counsel. There's a big question mark tonight about why she's leaving today, Anderson. All
right, Jeff Zeleny. Jeff, thanks. Perspective now from a Democratic member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
First of all, Hope Hicks's departure, obviously a surprise, I think, to many people. What do you make of it and the impact it may have on the president? Because very few people are closer to him than her.
Anderson, this looks to me like more evidence of a White House in disarray. If we were going to name all the people who have either left or been fired just in the last couple months, we'd spend your whole show just going through it. And
not to mention just communications directors.
And we continue to be faced with the key kinds of questions. One that you and I have talked about is I still think a lot needs to be done to follow the money. And today there were new stories in the press describing potential financial entanglements by Jared Kushner.
Right. I mean, do you think, the New York Times has reported Jared Kushner received hundreds of millions in loans for his private businesses from two companies after hosting them at the White House for official businesses. Do you have confidence? Can Jared Kushner remain in his position? Should he remain in his position?
Obviously, John Kelly has had to act with respect to his security clearances, and there's been a question about John Kelly's role with respect to security clearances in the first place. I had to ask Chris Wray, the FBI director, to finally get a straight story about when the White House was informed about Rob Porter and some of his potential security clearance problems. You have security clearance problems at the White House, and you're potentially compromising sources and methods in what can be very serious intelligence matters.
It's also interesting because this is a president who ran on, in A, hiring the best people, and B, going after Hillary Clinton for not handling classified information properly, said she would be the only president who wouldn't be able to get a security clearance. The irony is a lot of people closest to this president can't get security clearances.
And he seems to get so caught up in potential efforts to try to discredit Bob Mueller, which aren't going anywhere because Bob Mueller has been so professional. With respect to all these memos and the Nunes memo and the Schiff memo, the fact of the matter is there's plenty of evidence on the Trump aides independent of the dossiers. But the fact was the president was so interested in trying to somehow discredit Bob Mueller, which was never going anywhere. He just gets caught up in these stories.
You've called on the Senate Intelligence Committee to hold public hearings on the president's finances. I mean, unless Republicans agree to that, that's not going to happen. Do you see any willingness on their part? Because the president himself has said to the New York Times a long time ago that that would be some sort of a red line.
What this is about, this is essentially a policy difference between the chairman and I and others. The chairman doesn't really think these follow the money issues are the heart of the committee's business. I think, for example, follow the money is counterintelligence 101. The way you compromise people is through money. So I'm going to keep making the case. We're looking at matters relating to that Palm Beach purchase.
So even if this is business dealings from 10 years before he decided to run for office, you think that's fair game?
Well, the question, for example, in several of these matters, the Palm Beach property, we're looking at Mr. Torshin and potential involvement with the NRA. The question is, when you have these kinds of financial entanglements by the president or some of his associates, are they potential blackmail targets? Are they potential targets who can be compromised from the standpoint of counterintelligence?
Which is the same question about Jared Kushner and others who may have financial dealings. The continuance by this president of attacking his own attorney general publicly. I mean, we're just shaming him. We just saw it today. We now, according to the Washington Post, it's one of the questions that Mueller and his team are asking people about. Last summer, the public shaming. Have you ever, does it make sense to you for a president to be publicly shaming his attorney general?
I think it is just bizarre. I don't know any other way to characterize it. The reality is the president, again, not really understanding the function of the job. I mean, no president is above the law. The position that Jeff Sessions holds means he's got to follow the law. It's not as if he's just working for the president. He's working for the American people.
And that's what he said in his statement today, kind of pushing back on the president. Senator Wyden, appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Very much. Joining us now, a former White House Communications Director, David Gergen, also David Chalian and Gloria Borger. Let's talk about Hope Hicks. I mean, David Gergen, you've worked in a lot of White Houses. Have you seen in any White House where you worked that there is somebody as close to the president as Hope Hicks? I mean, she really kind of plays a role similar probably to Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, just in terms of their proximity and access to the president.
I've certainly never seen anybody as glamorous, so close to the president. And I think that's partly what distinguishes her. We've seen this parade of photographs. But no, I think she's very close to the president, but she was in this job. She's the fourth person in 14 months to be communications director.
What does that tell you?
It tells you that it's impossible to be successful in that job, because that job is all about planning strategy, communication strategy, themes, working it out. And you've got a president, of course, who uses Twitter to bust up all that.
You were communications director under Reagan.
I was.
Right.
I was indeed. But, you know, that was, of course, he was charmed by being communications director to the great communicator. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty easy to lay down, right?
And there was no Twitter.
There was no Twitter, but he was a disciplined, you know, he understood communications. He understood the importance of themes and trying to build support and eventually getting the big things done. And this president is more interested in conflict. And I think it's impossible to be an effective communication director. I'm sure she's been unhappy in the job, in that aspect of the job. She loves the glamour. I think everybody would for a while, but it wears off.
David Chalian, I mean, it's just weird that this happened today. Again, because if you're a communications director, you want to emphasize the good, and President Trump had this headline-making meeting, which we'll talk about at this hour, about guns, a bipartisan meeting in the White House that probably surprised a lot of people, pushing against Republicans, calling them, saying that them to their face, they're afraid of the NRA and they got to push back, talking about comprehensive, gun reform. And then, not an hour later or so, this announcement from Hope Hicks overshadowing the meeting that they just had.
It's like example A of bad communication strategy, right? I mean, there is no logical reason that this should have come out today, because that is not in anybody's communications plan would be for that to happen. So it raises the question of, well, just how much then? Even if this was in the works, how much did yesterday's testimony before the House Intelligence Committee and the headlines about white lies, and we know from our reporting that the president was none too pleased about that, how much did that play into any acceleration of this announcement today, even if it was in the works?
Well, and don't forget, Hope Hicks has just been through the whole Rob Porter issue, and there were stories at the time that she was thinking of leaving then and tendering her resignation then, after she managed the response to it, which a lot of people, including myself, thought was a bit of a conflict. But, you know, you can understand anybody wanting to leave this White House, quite honestly. That's not the surprise. What's the surprise is that she is sort of the ultimate loyalist. She's been with him since day one. I've been told that he needs her for emotional support, and a friend of his said to me that he thinks he's going to go into a tailspin without her around, because she was sort of like a comfort blanket in many ways, and he needs that because his family is growing more and more distant.
And Keith Schiller, who was his body man, who's been with him for years and years, left earlier before.
Yeah, and I do think it's important that a president does need emotional support in the White House. Often it comes from his family, but his wife is not exactly giving off signals of a warm and fuzzy relationship right now.
And also, if your family is part of this investigation, that adds to stress.
And he's engaged in this folly of running the White House like a family business. So it's very, very hard to distinguish emotions from conflicts of interest. It's just all roiled together. And increasingly, Anderson, two things are happening, and Hope Hicks underscores it. A lot of people in there are thinking about their reputations and how soon do they have to get out to protect their reputations. They will be a badge of honor to work for Donald Trump in some circles. But for a lot of other places, it's kind of, this is a really hard thing to have on your resume, and you have to explain. But the other thing is, how do you then find the people you need to fill those jobs who are really good?
Hard thing. We're going to take a quick break. More of this conversation. When we come back, we'll bring in the rest of the panel. We'll also have new reporting from the Washington Post that Robert Mueller is examining that time period last summer when President Trump seemed determined to fire Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
This is Lobster Fest at Red Lobster, with exciting new dishes like dueling lobster tails and lobster truffle mac and cheese. Classics like
a subtext that people in the White House will say to you, it is unclear to them whether Donald Trump can effectively govern, whether he's capable of it in terms of his own abilities, conduct, and whether or not things have gotten to the point where the wheels are coming off of this presidency. We don't know that, but certainly people in the White House are openly with each other and with journalists raising those kinds of questions.
It's not clear who has authority or what authority.
Back now with our panel. Joining us at the table, Carrie Cordero, Jen Psaki, and Mike Shields. Mike, for this White House, I mean, Hope Hicks, again, as we've been saying, was about as close to the president as anybody.
Yeah, she goes back, predates everyone on the campaign and worked for the Trump family before she got involved in this. Sort of a unique person in that regard because she wasn't political. And I think my guess is she will continue to be close to the president. I think that this is like a family member. And so whatever she's going to do after this, she'll still be a close confidant. She'll probably still be running press traps that she does very well. Quietly. She doesn't have her name in the paper, but she is very, very effective at running traps for the president. I'm guessing she'll continue to do that from the outside. And so, this decision, I don't believe, was related to anything that happened this week. And Maggie,
you don't think so?
Well, and Maggie Haberman reported that in the New York Times. People don't leave the White House when they're that close to the president after one day of something. It's something that's been talked about for a while, I believe.
But just from a communication standpoint, why announce this then on the same day where the president has had this important meeting? I mean, maybe the White House didn't like the way it turned out and they wanted to switch attention, but you could argue it was an important thing that they would have wanted attention on.
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain that. And there's all kinds of reasons why someone might want to leave or what the timing is for that. But, the thing is, there was going to be something else that came out later on after this anyway. There's like 4 other stories since this afternoon. So
why not?
So in some ways, it doesn't matter.
But Jen, I mean, you, as a former communications director in the Obama administration, she's the 5th communications director since this president took office. Is that an unusually high turnover?
Yes, we had about 5 communications directors over the course of 8 years. And I was in the role for almost 2 years, and I left because it was the end of the presidency. So typically people serve for 2 years, maybe 3 years. Longer than that is a pretty lengthy amount of time because it is a high stress, high burnout job. But this number of communications directors speaks to a level of chaos and uncertainty in the White House. It may be that it is basically an impossible job to do under this president.
Well, Carrie, also just from a legal standpoint, Hope Hicks is now deeply involved. I mean, she's gone before Mueller already. She was testifying just yesterday. She's also testified to the Senate. I mean, she has been at the sort of epicenter of a number of very potentially important meetings where, allegations of obstruction or other things are being looked at.
Right. I mean, I think she definitely has some legal exposure, particularly on the obstruction piece. If we want to look at a particular instance that we know about publicly, it's her involvement in crafting a message related to covering up what happened at the June 2016 meeting in Trump Tower.
The Donald Trump Jr. meeting with Russia.
Exactly. So she has some legal exposure. And you know what? I understand that there's reporting that, she was going to do this anyway, but she just came off of 9 hours of testifying in front of Congress. And I've prepared in my prior life, I prepared senior government executives for testifying before the Hill. I've testified. It's a intense process, and she is doing it under hostile circumstances because they want to know information that she has based on her close access to this president over the course of the last year. We have these major investigations, and so that, I'm sure, no matter what messaging people say, that had to have been a stressful experience to go through.
It doesn't mean that played a role in someone that close to the president leaving. I just want to point one thing out about the number of communications directors. I think you should really, this White House is different in many ways. It's almost like it doesn't really, the president's the communications director. Hope had that title. She's really a very close senior advisor to the president that was given the title communications director because she works on things. This White House probably won't replace her. They probably won't have another one. You have Sarah Huckabee Sanders handling the press, and you don't really have a comms director role in this White House. But
the fact that the president is essentially the communications director and tweets out, isn't that maybe why there's been 5 official communications directors? Because
yeah, I think they were feeling their way through this. There's this role that other White Houses have. My guess is they're going to say, we don't really have that role. Things are different here. And so to say that Hope is one more of those, she's not like a normal communications director sleeping in the White House.
The problem here is that they also, the president and other people there, don't see communications as a strategic tool. They are not effectively using it. They are terrible at communications. They're not using it to get legislation done. They're not using it to build support in the public. So their approach has not been effective. Yes, it may not be the fault of the individuals. In fact, it probably isn't. But they need a new strategy in that regard at this point.
I mean, in past White Houses, if there's been an infrastructure week, the White House has tended to focus on infrastructure. It seems like in this White House, there'll be an infrastructure week or jobs week.
Or infrastructure hour.
Right, but then it's like the president hasn't gotten the memo and changes the conversation.
Look, when you've got an economy that's growing the way this one is, a pretty robust pace, he's passed a major tax bill, and he's sitting at 35% approval rating, you've got a real communications problem. You should be able to go to the country and build bigger support than that. And I would argue it's not that they don't need one. They desperately need a new communications director who is empowered to do the job that's there, to let this president, enable this president, and get other people out of the way and get him off Twitter so they can build up support from where they are. Nobody would sit there. This is malpractice.
I'm not arguing that they don't need one, but what I would say is I'm sure you know better than anybody, every White House sets itself up a little bit differently to tailor to the strengths and weaknesses of the commander-in-chief. In this particular White House, he acts as the communications director. So my only point was I don't believe that they will have one. I'm not saying whether they do need one, but whoever gets put in that job is always going to be in line with having to talk to the president where he's the one who's leading the messaging out of the White House.
And the reason they've had so many is because Donald Trump thinks the ones who have left are not as good as he is. And, you know, so you can tick them off. And with Hope Hicks, it's a little different, I think.
I think he's a pretty good communications director as a campaigner. That I think he does very, very well. What he's not good at is a communicator, as trying to govern and trying to build coalitions that get things done.
This is broader, though, than just the issue of their communications directors. This working in this White House, whether it's as communications director or whether it's in any other capacity as senior advisor to this president, is basically a one-way ticket to testifying in front of the grand jury or testifying in front of Congress or being involved in some way in an investigation and having to hire a lawyer and having legal exposure. And so I don't think that her decision can only be viewed through the lens of they're making a decision about communications director. She is one of many people who now has had to testify, be interviewed by FBI agents, which if they haven't gone through that before, you know, also is a significant issue.
But it's not going to end just because she leaves.
No,
by the way.
And it's not going to, but it will enable her to focus on dealing with that issue.
Right, but she's still going to have to continue with all of that.
We've talked about her outsized significance, but the reason why I think the departure is so surprising as well, even if it was in the works, even in the midst of the reporters, is because Hope was so committed. If any of us who have had conversations with her throughout the course of this presidency, the passion she feels that Donald Trump is being wronged by everyone in the press, being wronged in the way he's been treated, and that nobody is giving him his... I mean, this is not like any other political operative where you have a conversation and they explain the president's thinking on this. This is somebody who felt it in her bones. And so I think that's why this is so surprising and why it's noteworthy that it's coming after a pretty stressful week.
She would never go on background or off the record and badmouth the president of the United States. I mean, and there are lots of people in the White House who will do that.
True believer.
Not Hope Hicks.
Let's take a quick break. Coming up, new reporting on Jared Kushner, White House meetings, and loans to his family business. Also, late news on Robert Mueller's interest in the president's campaign, seemingly to drive his attorney general to quit.
I've got to say, I love the new place.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I took your advice and had Geico help with renter's insurance. It was really easy.
Easy?
The President's Man, you've probably seen this. I've watched it probably several hundred times. It became a catchphrase for investigators worldwide. Take a look.
You tell me what you know, and I'll confirm. I'll keep you in the right direction if I can, but that's all. Just follow the money.
Hal Holbrook, I think, playing the character. This is
Deep Throat, who was Mark Felt,
right, who was
number
Mark,
2.
right, from the FBI. Do you, I mean, this is kind of a dumb question, but do you miss the days when you were talking to sources in dark garages? Or maybe you still do,
Well, he still
do you guys
does.
still do that?
We both do. Of course.
I go out and move a flower pot in our backyard.
Right, and the gardener shows up.
But in All the President's Men, you write extensively about, I don't want to use the actual term, it was rat effing, which was a term that the Nixon team had for basically messing around with election campaigns. It is amazing when you think about that compared to the Russia's efforts, I mean, which is rat effing on a major scale.
Both of these events, Watergate was about Richard Nixon's attempt to undermine the electoral system of the United States, the most basic element of American democracy,
and he
underwrite the right to vote. Because what the object of all that political espionage and sabotage was Nixon wanted to run against George McGovern, the weakest candidate the Democrats could put up. He did not want to run against the strongest candidate, Edmund Muskie. And he and his aides set out to devise this vast campaign of political espionage and sabotage to undercut and destroy the Muskie campaign, and they succeeded. And, of course, the allegations of, quote, collusion, and what the Russians tried to do was to determine the outcome of an American election, to affect an American election. So in both cases,
and Bob,
ironically enough, you're dealing with the same allegation in some way.
Well, Nixon succeeded, as Carl pointed out, but we don't know the impact of the Russian meddling, and that's a big issue, and maybe we'll never know. Right. And we don't know. I mean, there's so much noise out there, and there's so much, you know, oh, they determined the election. No, they didn't. Oh, half these ads that are being questioned actually ran after the election and so could not affect the election. So it's a lot of work, and I think one of the points we agree on is that there's a lot of work that Mueller and the House and the Senate investigations need to do, but so does the media, and not just a reaction to the daily event, but doing the 4-hour interviews, going and knocking on the door at night, meeting people, and really establishing a relationship of trust so you can find out what they really know.
One other aspect
on the phone.
One other aspect, though, of this story that's very different, and that is whatever the Russians did, and we might never find out what the effect was in terms of the election itself, they have destabilized us and continue to by this whole investigation and the fact that we are in this paroxysm of trying to deal with what they have done and the president's reaction to it. That the destabilization that has taken place through Russia's efforts is extraordinary.
Did Watergate, you know, I've talked to people who were in the Clinton White House who said that President Clinton was able to compartmentalize the investigations that were going on into him and governing. Whether, I guess it's an arguable point. Was Nixon able to do that? Because that's the criticism that's been made against President Trump is that essentially there's been reporting, I think it was from the Washington Post and New York Times, that briefers are loath to bring up Russia to him because he takes it personally as a delegitimizing, an attempt to delegitimize his election.
Well, your point, it takes a toll, and you can't kind of, you know, particularly when you've got emotional people like Nixon was, like Trump is, and you, the idea that you can kind of shut it down and then say, oh yeah, now let's talk about the budget, let's do this. I mean, some of that's going on. You know, you really wonder, and it's something that everyone needs to think about. what is the governing impact? Are we being governed? I mean, all this discussion, oh, we'll do this legislation, oh, we can't do that, we can't, I mean, maybe they're going to do none.
Right. Well, I would also want to put up a headline, one of your headlines from July 1973, Nixon sees witch hunt, insiders say, which is just, I mean, it's the exact term.
How did you find that?
We're, you know, hardworking producers.
Thank you.
But I mean, well, it's clearly that pushback was not effective for Nixon, but
he also tried to make the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate at the beginning, but not to the extent.
In fact, I also want to play a clip of Nixon talking to his press secretary, Ron Ziegler, on the phone. This is from December of '72. Let's just quickly play that. It's about the press.
I want it clearly understood that from now on, ever, no reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House. Is that clear? Absolutely. Unless it's a press conference. Yes, sir. And the briefings here, but on a briefing. But never in the White House. No church service. Nothing that Mrs. Nixon does. You tell Connie, don't tell Mrs. Nixon because she'll approve it. No reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House again, and no photographer either. No photographer. Is that clear? Yes, sir. None ever to be in. Now that is a total order, and if necessary, I'll fire you. You understand? I do understand. Okay.
It's about the wedding.
Yes, but it's also about a mindset, right? And that is, this shows again that Nixon didn't understand the press. The answers to Watergate questions weren't in the White House. You're not going to walk in and talk to those people. You have to go see them at night, and you have to develop a method and a technique of just saying, you know, we're not going to stop. But we had editors and owners at the Post who said, don't stop.
But so much of the language, though, used by that White House, Ron Ziegler in October of '72 said of your reporting, quote, I personally feel that this is shabby journalism by the Washington Post, based totally on hearsay and innuendo, a blatant effort at character assassination. We hear this now time and time again about unnamed sources from this administration attacking.
Well, Richard Nixon always had an adversarial relationship with the press, going back to when he was a congressman, going back to when he was senator and vice president. What you have with Trump, though, Trump's career was built on manipulating the press, on having a great relationship with the New York Post and the New York Daily News. And even to the point where we know that Donald Trump, impersonating someone who called himself John Barron, would call in gossip stories about the beautiful blondes that he was going out with to Studio 54. He has been accustomed to having a fawning press, and now he has come to Washington. He has gotten caught up in his own conduct, which is there for all to see. Question of whether it's criminal or not, we'll find out. But the question about his stability, that Republicans in Congress have asked, it's all out there, and he cannot believe that the press, which he once so controlled, will go with these stories, and he just goes and says they're the enemy of the people because he can't do anything about it.
But he takes them seriously, and he believes lots of those stories that are critical because they're coming from people who work with him.
We got to take another quick break. More with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. The Trump presidency is a surprise to some people, not to President Nixon. He and his wife saw it coming decades ago. President Trump has the letter to prove it. More from both men next.
There's a Russian program. They call them Sparrows. Trained to
Positions on gun control that have been largely opposed by members of his own party. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar was in the room. I talked to her earlier.
The states that have these background checks.
I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. I wonder, first of all, what were your key takeaways from it?
First of all, it felt like something of a real discussion, and that was important. Secondly, the president clearly committed to a strong background check bill, a strong universal background check bill. And he said he didn't want a weak bill. It's clear he wanted to close the gun show loophole, that he wanted to do something about background checks. And of course, many of my colleagues that have been through the immigration debate in the last few weeks have seen him say one thing and the next day say another. So we have to hold him to this because the American people are very focused on this now. Young people going to march in the streets. And if we do nothing after he has said this, I don't think that's going to work very well for him. And so we had that discussion. He agreed to include my bill on domestic violence, which is a very simple bill that's now passed in 12 states that makes sure that if people are dating each other and there's been an act of domestic violence and a conviction, that you can't get a gun there. So I thought it was really interesting, and probably, I'm sure you agree, the most interesting part was when he was taking on members of his own party and basically telling them that he wanted to get something done.
The president pushed, as you said, for a larger comprehensive bill. That was his word. I mean, is that a wise approach in your opinion? Because your colleague, Senator Rubio, told CNN after the meeting that it's ideal if you could do it all at once, but, quote, I just don't think it's likely to pass knowing this place.
He can say that all he wants, but then he's going to have to face all those kids in Florida and really people all over the country, because I've seen this before. For a long time, the moms have been taking the torch and valiantly tried to change this. After Sandy Hook, you saw the parents and the mothers. It's different when kids take it over, this is my impression. So if our Republican colleagues are going to be saying, well, we just want to do something really small just to respond, I don't think that's going to work. And they are talking to me about things like assault weapons, and they're talking about the background check that the president said he'd support today, things like closing the terrorist loophole, domestic violence. So I think that's why the president was referring to a more comprehensive bill. And as I said, I'm from a proud hunting state, and I look at every proposal and I say, would this hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? And I don't think any of these rational proposals that we've been discussing would do that.
You mentioned the immigration meeting that the president held back in January, and it was sort of a similar format. There was a feeling that things might really change after that, because at some point he seemed to side with Democrats, and then Republicans would speak and he'd sort of go back to their position and then go back to the Democratic position. Things haven't changed since that immigration meeting. Both sides retreated to their partisan corners.
That is my worst fear. It's everyone's worst fear, but we are where we are. And I think one difference is that he has made this really clear 10 times that he wanted a strong universal background check bill. And the American people saw him do that. He, unlike other cases where he said, I want to add this to immigration, I want to add that, he actually specifically said to Steve Scalise, who he said he loved, that he didn't think we should be adding a bill that would have actually expanded access to guns. And he specifically said that to him, and he said, well, that's because Amy and Diane wouldn't support it. That happened. So that does feel different to me than how he's handled the immigration debate. But again, I'm not naive here. It could easily happen, but it won't happen if the American people hold him to what he said today.
Senator Klobuchar, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, coming up next, even more breaking news on guns from the biggest retailer in the country.
Last night took an L, but tonight I bounce back.
What's an L?
The rap singer took a loss.
A campaign to obstruct justice. That's one of the things, according to a new report in the Washington Post, that Robert Mueller is looking into. Kerry, if in fact the Mueller team is looking into this, and frankly, I think there's a lot of things the Mueller team is asking questions about, and I think Bob Woodward made this point in the last hour. Doesn't necessarily mean there's any there, or that's a particular focus of theirs. They just need to, in an 8-hour, 10-hour interview, there's a lot of boxes to check off.
There's a lot that they need to. They're conducting an investigation, and so they're going to ask a lot of questions. Now, I do think that they're asking questions about Sessions and his efforts to all the pressure that he has placed on the Attorney General. It could be part of an obstruction case. The obstruction case is not just limited to one event. So, for example, it's not just limited to the fact that he fired Director Comey. It is a pattern of activity that he engaged in from the start of when he came into office, of putting pressure particularly on the Justice Department, particularly on individuals who were involved in the investigation prior to Director Comey leaving and the special counsel being appointed, and after. But he's gone after Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General. He has consistently gone after individuals who he believes are in charge of this investigation. And it is consistent, it is deliberate, and it is his effort because he doesn't understand and doesn't respect the independence of the Justice Department.
But if he wanted to fire the Attorney General, he could fire the Attorney General.
He could fire the attorney general, although then he would have to appoint somebody new, nominate somebody new, who then would have to go to a Senate confirmation. The attorney general so far has, I think, tried to walk a certain line on certain decisions. He has done the absolute right thing. For example, recusing himself from the Russia investigation. But the president consistently goes after the attorney general, goes after anybody that he thinks is administering justice in a way that is different than what is in his own political interest.
Right, but if it was obstruction of justice, then what it would be is not a tweet out to the public, which is we've just discussed, is his communications device, right? What he's saying is, I'm frustrated because I actually can't control the Justice Department. Obstruction of justice would be controlling the Justice Department. It would be calling Jeff Sessions on the phone and saying, stop this investigation. That would be, or don't testify. Tell people not to testify to Mueller about what's going on.
He made phone calls to members of Congress. He had the director of the FBI in front of him and said, can't you make this investigation go away? So he did that too.
Not true. Members of Congress are in the legislative branch, okay? They have oversight over the executive branch. You can't have obstruction of justice when the executive asks the legislative branch to do something.
Right, but according to the reporting, he did call up Don McGahn and ask him to fire.
This story is Mueller looking at obstruction because he bitches and complains about what Jeff Sessions is doing publicly? That's absurd. Maybe he's looking into it, but to me, I'm obviously not a lawyer. But it is crazy for me to think that the President of the United States, who could fire the Attorney General or anyone he wants to fire in the Justice Department, isn't firing them, is admitting, you know what, I have no control over them, and it makes me angry, so I'm going to communicate to the American people how angry I am openly.
But doesn't your argument depend on like a rational actor model, which is like, you know, political science 101, that his tweets are well thought out with a plan? I mean, they could just be, he's annoyed and he's just venting.
And I'm sure maybe that's why Mueller's looking at it, which is he trying to influence through the tweets? And my point is, when you have the ability to influence other ways, which is call them and fire them or call them not to testify, then tweets are a weak version of that.
He has done all of these things, though, right? He called the FBI director into the White House, had a meeting with him, and asked him if he could make an investigation go away. Okay, that's an in-person meeting. He has called other individuals and tried to put pressure on this investigation. His tweets are a piece of it. He tweeted at Director Comey after he was fired that there might be tapes. That was potentially intimidating a witness. He has gone after Andy McCabe, the former deputy director of the FBI, in both publicly and privately. So his tweets,
when you put it all together, it sounds so negative.
And I realize that if you're going to go to, say, a jury, which won't happen, but if you're going to go to a jury, you may want evidence to say, look at this pattern. But the idea that a tweet complaining that I can't control the Justice Department, and I'm complaining about it publicly to the American people, is somehow obstruction of justice.
I cannot imagine a clearer case of someone in a position of authority trying to change the outcome of a legal proceeding than what we're watching. You know, to call people in and say, go easy on Flynn. What are we talking about? If that's not trying to change the outcome, that's the reason he's trying to do all this. And he has smeared, you know, his attorney general. He smeared Comey. He smeared Mueller. You know, there's a long list. And that is a way to diminish public approval, public acceptance, public respect for the investigation. He's laying the groundwork. Just
like the Democrats did to Ken Starr. They wanted to lower his approval rating and lower his credibility during an investigation.
Demagogue whatever the outcome is if he doesn't like it. But there's just, you know, this is just, most of the time when you see obstruction, you have to dig for it. Here, it's just right out in front of us. You can't ignore it. It's just like, there's like, obvious.
Well, and the fact that it's public doesn't mean that it's not happening.
Yeah.
You know, most people, if they're trying to obstruct justice, might try and do it privately, which is, I think,
but the
your
stories
point.
about Mueller publicly investigating or asking questions about public shaming. And what I'm saying is that particular part of it, publicly shaming somebody and trying to denigrate an investigation publicly is not obstruction of justice.
You're taking issue with simply the headlines when the reality is we have a lot more content that goes behind it.
Also,
it's the tip of the iceberg.
Wouldn't be asking the people about public tweets, which he can read. He would be asking the people who were there at the time, what else was the president doing around that time, I assume.
Well, there's another piece of this, which is that part of what he's doing through the tweets is trying to put pressure on the Attorney General to resign. And what is the effect of that? The effect of Jeff Sessions resigning is that Rod Rosenstein no longer has to be the individual in charge of the Russia investigation, overseeing the special counsel. And that goes to the president's efforts to try to derail this
He's going to put pressure on him to resign through Twitter instead of calling him and firing.
Well, this is why Mueller wants to talk to the president. Because if he's going to think about obstruction, he needs to know the president's
get a break in.
intent.
Just ahead, inside the televised session with President Trump and lawmakers at both parties, where the president seemed to take not just one, but several Democratic positions on gun control, telling some of the Republicans in the room that they're afraid of the NRA. A remarkable moment. We'll talk to a Democratic senator who was there.
We have to do something about it. I've seen them all. Big, small, wide, slim. Which is why at Men's Warehouse,